Well, good morning, and it's my great pleasure to talk to you today about a topic that I didn't know very much about just a little while ago. In case you need to know, I've been a professor in the Department of Food Science for 27 years, and I'm a crystallization person, working on milk fat, on all kinds of different fats, and lately lubricants, cosmetics. So today I've been tasked to talk to you about free fatty acids in milk. It's actually, at the beginning I was a little bit disappointed about it because it's like, I know nothing about this. And then I got into it, and it's a really interesting topic, and a lot of work has been done in this area I found throughout time. Let's start somewhere to try to define the problem and see what's going on in the field. So first of all, the lipids in milk. What kind of lipids are in milk? And it's quite heterogeneous. The fat in milk is about 96%, but we must not forget that there's phospholipids in there and partial glycerides, and we'll talk about partial glycerides, which are breakdown products of the fat. So there is breakdown products of the fat. There's diglycerides, a little bit of monoglycerides, and here are the famous free fatty acids that everybody seems to be focusing on these days for X, Y, or Z reason. Here's the Maryland, US area, and here's the range in the United States. If you're interested in free fatty acids, look at that range, 0.1 to 0.44. And being a physical chemist myself, the thing I hate the most is people that don't put units behind their numbers. And I have actually 2 slides on that, as you will see. So there's between 0.1 and 0.44 elephants in milk fat. I just can't understand that. So I had to learn this, so I'm going to make you suffer. So here we go. I'm not a biologist. I took grade 9 biology. That's the last time I took biology. So seemingly you eat fat, and they get assembled, they get broken down by your pancreatic lipase, and then they get assembled in lipoproteins. And these lipoproteins are floating around in your blood, and the lipoproteins then hit a certain target here, and a lipase breaks them down, the lipoprotein lipase. So it takes these lipoproteins, which have all the lipids you ate at the Burger King, and breaks them down, and then some of it goes for energy, some of them goes for milk making, some of them goes to burn in the muscle to give you like strength to lift all that weight, and some of it goes to your adipose tissue. So it's a pretty functional system, all controlled by this lipoprotein lipase. That's the culprit, or the famous or infamous person in all of this murder mystery. And here we depict again this chylomicron. You've probably heard about the different lipoproteins. There's high density, low density, very low density, and chylomicrons, depending on how much protein there is versus lipid. The high density lipoproteins have more protein and vice versa. So here are these chylomicrons, and here's the LPL, lipoprotein lipase, the lipase in milk. I do not understand why milk has so much lipoprotein lipase. We'll talk about that. Is the cow crazy? Maybe. So there's a ton of lipoprotein lipase, and look at this ApoC2, and that's a apoprotein. It's the protein that is in the lipoproteins, but this lipoprotein lipase just likes one of them the most. So they hang out, and then it hydrolyzes the triglycerides in the chylomicrons. Then they go into the endothelial cells. Endothelial cells. And what happens in there? Where? So here we are, the blood lipids. So all these lipids floating in the blood, assembled into lipoproteins, and it gets broken down by lipoprotein lipase. And within this mammary epithelial cell, you have now your fatty acids, the ones we're trying to talk about. But the good part is until the end, so you have to suffer with me here. And then they get resynthesized into triglycerides, into lipid again within there. And then it's a really complex process that takes place in there. And at the end of the day, these fat droplets actually get assembled into a milk fat globule. The cow wants, and then it gets excreted into the milk. And that's how the milk gets its fat. But the fat is surrounded by a hell of a membrane. And so that's what happens. So let's go and talk about the lipoprotein lipase. And this is the most painful part of the talk. So, I mean, this is the heart rate going to like 90% of max here, and you're sweating a lot on this. So first of all, there's no crystal structure of lipoprotein lipase. It must be difficult to crystallize. So this is pancreatic lipase. Scientists are very good at making cartoons. So there it is in full color. That's pancreatic lipase. And this is the work. This was very painful to me too, because there's a lot of information of this, and most of it is ridiculously complicated. So I'm listing it here for you and your progeny to look into. So we agreed that lipoprotein lipase catalyzes the hydrolysis of triglycerides, so triglycerides, in the chylomicrons and very low density lipoproteins. It doesn't like the high density or low density. It is related to pancreatic lipase and hepatic lipase, so there's no mystery there. However, nobody talks about this, but the work of Oliver Krona has shown that it not only hydrolyzes the fat, but it hydrolyzes phospholipids and other esters in the lipoproteins, the things that make up the milk fat globule membrane. It has been shown in vitro. So let's not disregard that as a possible source of free fatty acids. Has specificity for certain parts of the triglyceride, SN13. It doesn't really like one fatty acid over the other one. This was painful conclusions from a lot of papers. It's normally associated with the casein micelle. This thing here likes to get stuck on things. And it likes to hang out the casein micelle. Okay, you explain this one to me. Has no function in the milk. In humans, we have bile salt stimulated lipase. The bile salt stimulates the lipase in human milk, and the lipase helps break down the fat for the baby. That doesn't happen in cows. However, there's 1 to 2 milligrams of active enzyme per liter. So either it has a function or the cow is crazy. One of the two. And there's no consensus really in the literature of why it would have so much lipoprotein lipase. There must be a reason, right? It is inhibited itself by fatty acids because this lipoprotein lipase likes to stick to the membrane. Fatty acids also stick to the membrane once they get produced, so they fight against each other, and it gets inhibited, just a physical effect on the interface. It gets activated by a whole bunch of things like bovine serum albumin. It's a requirement for lipoprotein activity. It has a reputation for being an activator, but what it is, it's a sponge. It sponges off the free fatty acids that are floating around, and so the lipoprotein lipase is not inhibited. It's more of a physical effect, and calcium does the same thing. It is a big protein. It's a glycoprotein with polysaccharides steaming out of it. It can be released from the casein micelle with some salt and heparin, and heparin has a high affinity for the lipoprotein, which is a glycoprotein, so they like to stick to each other. The optimal reaction conditions are, no surprise, 37 degrees, pH 9, but it is very heat labile. So if you pasteurize the milk, you'll kill it. So that's good, right? Almost completely destroyed by a typical high temperature, short time. Now, milk has a ton of activity in there, enough to hydrolyze the entire milk in less than fat in milk in less than 10 minutes. But I told you before, in the milk, the fat exists in the milk fat globule membrane. Now, I'm building, like, stay with me here. Okay, stay. I know it's painful. Now, the milk fat globule is a complicated thing. As that fat goes to the cell, it starts ripping things from the endoplasmic reticulum, and as it gets excreted out, it gets surrounded by part of the plasma membrane of those cells. It's incredible. So it ends up having a ton of stuff around it. And it's a very strong membrane, and it's very complicated. It has sphingolipids, phospholipids, all kinds of enzymes. Let's not discuss them. But that is a hell of a membrane. It even has a cytosolic part in the middle. So there's a membrane, a well, another layer of phospholipids. The cow was really trying to protect that milk fat for some reason. So remember, there's a milk fat globule membrane. We're building. Now, what is the origin of those free fatty acids from a chemical point of view? You have a triglyceride, which is a fat. Now, the lipase will break it down one ester bond at a time, and you form a fatty acid, but you get a diglyceride. The diglyceride, under the action of the lipase, it makes a monoglyceride because there's just one left. Two left, one left, di-mono. And you produce more and more fatty acids. That is the origin of, mostly the origin of the monoglycerides and partial glycerides. Now, everybody's focusing on the free fatty acids, but let's not forget that these other two culprits are there too, and they're surface active too. So they could be affecting your cappuccino foam as well, as we will see in a second. And that's just a funky depiction of what happens in the active side of the enzyme. The enzyme is actually doing this, and it's doing it this way if you care to look into it. However, I'm putting another slide too. This is the breakdown of the fat, 95% of the component of the lipids in the. But we said that it can break down the phospholipids too. It has been shown. It has been shown. So here's your phospholipid, here's the lipase, here's a fatty acid, and here is a partial phospholipid, which is very surface active too. So free fatty acid-like in activity. And the more important part is that, remember that milk fat globule membrane, that's all mostly phospholipids. So now this stupid enzyme could chop up that membrane as well and get to the fat and create a disaster. Now, if somebody comes to you and says, we have a lot of free fatty acids in milk, you're like, wonderful, how much do we have? I mean, you guys are practical people, half engineers, all of you in your farms, and somebody tells you, yeah, it's more, what's that? So this is what I found in the literature, expressed as milliequivalents per 100 grams of fat. Not quite sure why they're using milliequivalents. I do not know what the stoichiometry of the reaction other than acid-base. Millimoles per liter of milk. I like that one. But I found millimoles per 100 grams of fat or milk. And then I found microequivalents per milliliter. And then I found no units at all. And that was the best one. And so if somebody gives you a number, what should be a good number? I'd like to know a good number. And then people sometimes give you percent. Don't work with that person who gives you percent. That person is really confused. Why? Because the way that you get to the percentage is you have grams of fatty acid, it's calculated, let's say that you grab the fat, it has fatty acids, it's an acid, you drop some base in there until the color changes. Oh, that's my free fatty acid level. And so you have moles of the NaOH that you titrated in the back room there at the farm. And then you have to multiply it by the molecular weight of the fatty acid. And then for 100 grams of milk or fat in milk. So this is the little problem with milk fat. Milk fat has a ton of fatty acids. Look at the molecular weight. Oh, hey, I have. Most people use oleic acid with a molecular weight of 282. If you go through the whole rigmarole, you end up with 0.7% gram per gram of fat. But if you use butyric acid, you end up with 0.22. That's what, 3 times difference between the two of them? It makes no sense. You would have to know what the fatty acid composition is of your hydrolyzed milk fat is. And who's going to do that? Come on. Like, we're not going to do that. So if you have to choose a fatty acid, you could be off by 300%. So percentage is meaningless. So the pain is over. Okay, let's talk about different things I found in the literature that were very interesting. One of them is spontaneous and induced lipolysis. A little weird, but I'm going along. You guys have your own idiosyncrasies. So let's talk about what the dairy literature talks about. So they talk about spontaneous lipolysis is initiating just by cooling the milk below 10 degrees Celsius. Soon after milking. Mystery. So the induced lipolysis arises due to physical damage to the milk fat globule membrane. Any agitation, pumping, and homogenization that occurs right after you milk the cow. Both proceed, especially during storage. If your milk is kept for 24 hours, that's when you start seeing the effect of whatever happened before. And the excellent previous talk about robotic milking and milking frequency, as you will see, all affect the free fatty acid levels. Now, let's continue with the spontaneous lipolysis. It's really due to a lack of integrity of that milk fat globule membrane. And then if you really looked at induced, what I'm going to talk about, it's still talking about the milk fat globule membrane. So I don't know why they divide it into two. It seems like it's all about the milk fat globule membrane and what anything or everybody or anybody does to that milk fat globule membrane. There's a bunch of activating factors. If you can read this and you find it cool, you're strange and you need to get out more. Because I mean, it obviously can be activated by the apoproteins. It can be influenced by oligosaccharides. It can be inhibited by some strange protein fractions. Monoglycerides removes the apoprotein C3 inhibition of lipoprotein lipase. So now they're starting to fight against each other. Yeah? So there's a lot of factors in terms of the biochemistry that are probably almost impossible to control or make up your mind on. Obviously, if your milk has inherently a lot of lipoprotein lipase, that's probably like a factor in it. Even though it's so active and there's so much to start off, I don't think we should start measuring that stuff. And then some people have focused on the lipoprotein lipase that is actually stuck to the milk fat globule membrane, whether that is important or not. And this is governed by all of these apoproteins, which may enhance binding to the milk fat globule membrane. We're always coming back to this milk fat globule membrane. Now, occurs at the farm. This is extremely high. If you have a milk of 10 millimoles per liter, you're shot. You might as well throw that away. Enhanced due to late lactation, due to poor quality feed, and as well by mastitis. I'll show you a little bit more information about that. Now, for mastitis, it's interesting because in mastitis, it's not only that you have the breakdown of the fat, but remember that little scheme I showed you about the biochemistry of making the fat? You have fatty acids, glycerol, and you make the fat. You also have leakage of that. So, like not completely made triglycerides leak out. And when that happens, you're bringing in the free fatty acids that should have been assembled into a triglyceride in there. So it's not only from hydrolysis, but from incomplete synthesis. Any transfer of blood components, there go the apoproteins, there goes the free fatty acids. Anytime you have transfer of blood, you're going to be activating that lipoprotein lipase. And then there is, and the bovine serum albumin also is an enhancer of lipoprotein activity. Now, there's also a mystery. Temperature activation can happen when mixing pre-cooled milk from a previous milker with warm milk. And if you want the maximum free fatty acid production, I don't know, you'd probably be fired if you do that, or you heat the milk to 25 to 35, and then you recool it to less than 10. That temperature activation activates the lipolysis process. There's a lot of mysteries here. Don't look at me for exact answers right now. And now let's go to the induced lipolysis of milk. And my conclusion after reading paper after paper after paper is, again, anything that causes a physical damage to the milk fat globule membrane, and we're talking about unit operations, pumping, stuff like that, will cause and increase lipolysis and free fatty acid production. So agitation, pumping, air incorporation, homogenization, and I do not know who would do this, mixing raw and homogenized milk. You're not doing that. Nobody does that, right? The homogenized milk breaks the milk fat globule membrane, exposes, activates the lipoprotein lipase. Now you have access to that. That is raw and homogenized milk. And so whatever you've done under homogenization in terms of breakage and activation now hits the raw milk and it will start hydrolyzing. And freezing thawing will do it as well. And there's complex graphs like this by Fitzgerald in 1974, depending, this is the free fatty acid levels, and this is temperature, the temperature at which you heat it up and then cool it down. Notice how there's even a biphasic kind of pattern. Here's the one we talked about, the heat activation, and then you cool it down again, you get the maximum free fatty acid level, but there's even a secondary one, and that's around 10 degrees. So if you heat it to 10, then cool it down, I guess from 5, and then you have a minimum here, and then it goes back up when you do it. Some people talk about what you're actually doing to them. You're doing partial melting of the triglycerides in the milk fat globule. It separates out a little bit. The shorter chains are now close to the surface, and the lipoprotein lipase has greater activity in that respect. And people have talking about now you create this free fat, but that's a little crazy. That's no good. Don't talk about free fat. It's not right. But there's a lot of free fat papers out there, so that the heating causes partial melting, they float to the surface inside the milk fat globule, and then they recrystallize, but now these shorter chains are really close to the surface, and the lipoprotein lipase can do its action on them. Makes sense, but nobody has shown it. Okay, so induced lipolysis in milk. What are some of the factors that enhance this? So free fatty acid levels in milk are enhanced after 24 hours due to increased milking frequency. So I ended up reading, thanks to you, Bulgarian papers. and check papers. It seems like they're very concerned either about somatic cell counts or, and then of course the Dutch. The Dutch, I'll show you some of the Dutch stuff. That's them. Yeah. So milking frequency. So here you have a control, 2 times milking, 4 times milking. Interestingly enough, I told you everything about the milk fat globule. They found that size and integrity of the milk fat globule seems not to be affected. Oops. Oh well. And here's at 0 hours. This is a control, 0.68. And I really like this one. It's 0.68. 0.68 bananas. And it goes to 0.72 bananas. There's no difference in the milking frequency at 0 hours. But after 24 hours, as I told you, this is a control, so it should be the same. But it went up from about 1.1 to 1.5. So this paper, at least, shows that, so 0 hours is immediately after milking. After 24 hours is 24 hours after milking. Okay, at least they were very explicit about that. So after 24 hours of refrigerated storage, the free fatty acids went up for the samples that came from cows that were milked 4 times a day. Increased milking frequency. Now, let me talk to you about something that you probably cannot read either here or in the print, is that we talked about lipoprotein lipase as being the lipase responsible for the breakdown of the milk. There's also lipases that can arise from psychrotrophic lipolytic bacteria like Pseudomonas. And all the halaboo that I told you about the milk lipoprotein lipase, how it's activated, for example, high levels in raw milk, effects in cheese butter, obvious at manufacture, does not change during storage, activated by the serum lipoproteins. Fresh milk and cream is basically affected by the lipoprotein lipase. But if you actually have the psychrotrophic bacteria growing in the milk, they'll produce the lipase, and now you have breakdown as well. These behave very differently, and one important thing is that the psychrotrophic lipases survive pasteurization temperatures. They survive 140 degrees C for 4 seconds. So if you have contamination by these bacteria, they like producing the lipase because it's food, right? And they're not affected by the milk fat globule. They are impervious to it. And milk fat globule membrane presents no barrier. But to the lipoprotein lipase, it does present a barrier. But these guys get right through. So if you have Pseudomonas contamination, which I'm assuming maybe people check for, the psychrotrophic lipolytic bacteria, they could be responsible for that. Now, so lipoprotein lipase and the whole story about it, because it has implications for human metabolism, physiology, health, and let's not forget these guys here. Again, not too much work in that area at all, just a mention by Deeth in his review paper of 2006 about, let's not forget, psychotrophic bacteria. Why do we care? That was supposed to be my talk before. I thought I'd change it to a nicer title. I mean, why should we care about anything? But why do we care? Okay, so we care because this work goes back to 1965. Please do not say something like, "Oh wow, the volume of the cappuccino is going down." That was published in 1965. There's no more research that is required in that area. I mean, there's this nice graphs like this, and you can read the Deeth and Smith paper, 1983, where this was beaten to death. Okay, so here it is. The free fatty acid levels in the milk and the depression in the steam frothing value. Okay, and the idea is that the free fatty acids are surface active components. So when you have an air bubble, I know quite a bit about this. When you have an air bubble and it's surrounded and stabilized by milk proteins, such as the whey proteins, the free fatty acids kick them out, because they're more surface active. So now you've lost all your stabilization of the foam. And let's not talk about monoglycerides and diglycerides maybe no, but maybe the monoglycerides play an effect there too. The free fatty acids are high enough that it will go in there and kill your cappuccino. So free fatty acids kill foams by displacing protein from the bubble surface, as shown by Buchanan in 1965. That's the year I was born. So there you go. And again, so the depression, but I want to show you something. Now, these numbers is my favorite, it's millimoles per liter. So like milk in its state, in its native state, when it's good milk, is around 0.8 if you need to know. And notice here, maybe remember this graph, at 2, you've lost like 80% of your foam volume. That's not a bad measure of it, right? So between 0.8 and 2. And we do play around that, but look how drastic it is really in the low end. So a small difference in your free fatty acid levels is going to make a huge difference in its commercial performance. I found that interesting, of that sort of abyss and then leveling off. So why should we care? Part 2, hydrolytic rancidity is because of the creation of free fatty acids. They taste rancid. You very much know the butyric acid notes of rancid milk. And for example, unacceptable, completely unacceptable milk was 1.5 millimoles per liter. So that you know more or less what sensor, but that's completely unacceptable. It's going to be picked up much before that. Now, because it's all related to surface effects, you're going to impair creaming ability during separation of the milk. Anything that hits interfaces is going to be affected by the free fatty acids. So increased creaming ability, you'll have increased churning time in the manufacture of butter. You have to break that membrane, and now you have extra free fatty acids. You also would have increased fat loss in whey during cheese production. And you could also have an inhibitory effect on starter cultures used in making fermented dairy products. So all those things are affected by those free fatty acid levels. Why should we care? Continued. This is Mikulova, and she had here, hey, you were just talking about this, the automated milking system, the milking parlor, and pipeline milking in stalls. And at least in her paper, she was showing how the somatic cell count went up this way, going from automatic to milking to pipeline. And the free fatty acids went up quite a bit too, going from automatic from 1.5. However, this lady has millimoles per 100 grams of fat. So I do not know what that number is. You have to assume a certain fat content of your milk and work backwards, and then who knows. So this number here goes up dramatically when you go from automatic milking system to milking parlor to pipeline milking in stalls. Seems to be the worst one for it. In terms of free fatty acid somatic cell count, that's a psychrotrophic bacteria, the ones that produce lipases, always also go up. This one here seems to be like actually going down, the total bacterial count. Don't ask me for answers for that. But that just shows you the milking technology will affect free fatty acids. And how do we analyze for this? You guys are pros at this. You use infrared spectrometry, spectroscopy. So I would assume that you can do some Fourier transfer mid-IR on it. You can do it by chromatography. You can have biosensors. You can do it by potentiometric titrations. Or you extract the fat and titrate it with the base and look at the color change. Either way, they're well-developed methods. All you just have to do is validate them accordingly. I mean, it's not rocket science. So what do we do in terms of what I do in future work here if I would ever study this area? I would probably spend a lot of time, if people are deciding that they should measure this or not, is to have a robust analytical method. But there's a lot of great people working in that area that you can approach. I would like to get into some of those crazy activations. You know, you drop the temperature of warm milk and then you activate it. So mechanism of heat, and then you heat it up and then you cool it down again. Why are we getting the activation of the lipoprotein LPL, not LDL, lipoprotein lipase activity? And also there's a whole bunch of papers, the work of Fox et al. In 1968 and Jensen and Pitas in 1976. They thought there was another lipase in milk. Not only the lipoprotein lipase, but there was another endogenous lipase. And somehow in the literature, you know, science can be very political, right? They got forgotten. It just got dropped and said, no, there's only the lipoprotein lipase. But then you do not know whether the samples were contaminated with psychrotrophic bacteria or it's a big mystery. I don't know really. I cannot come to a conclusion of why their work sort of disappeared, even though they had some pretty interesting characterization of a non-lipoprotein lipase in milk. And of course, it would be great because scientists like to make color cartoons to actually do the single crystal structure of lipoprotein lipase. Sorry about the LDL, should be LPL. Probably for you the most important one is maybe just the analytical methods, and maybe the mechanisms, maybe not, but it's very complicated, so the mechanism may help stop it if it represents a problem or not. And with that, I would like to acknowledge the funding agencies, NSERC and the Canada Research Chair Program, and you for your attention. Thank you.